My name is Harold Devries, and for 2 years after I buried my wife, I told myself the hardest part was already behind me. I was wrong. Grief, I learned, doesn't leave all at once. It settles into a house the way dust does, quiet and patient, and you don't notice how much of it has gathered until you try to move something that hasn't been touched in a while. I still keep the same routine Margaret and I built together. Coffee at 6. The newspaper I don't really need anymore, but buy anyway, because the man at the corner store always asks how I'm doing. And by 7, I'm usually sitting at the kitchen table looking out at the yard I used to keep better than I do now. It's not much of a life, some might say, but it's mine, and for a long time it was enough. I raised Tom in this house. I taught him to change a tire in that driveway. Margaret taught him to cook in that kitchen. And some Sundays I can still smell her cooking if I close my eyes and let myself remember hard enough. Tom and Priya live 200 miles from here, in a city I've visited more times than I can count, always the same way. I'd pack a bag, and I'd pack Margaret's old recipe box, the tin one with the rusted corner, because Priya always asked me to make the beef stew Margaret used to make, the one with the recipe card in Margaret's own handwriting. It became a kind of tradition between us. I'd show up, we'd cook together, and for one weekend a month, my house didn't feel quite so quiet. This last visit was supposed to be no different. I'd packed the bag 3 days early, the way I always do, an old habit from working the rail lines, where a man learns to be ready before he's needed. The recipe box sat on the kitchen counter, waiting. I remember looking at it Tuesday morning, thinking about which vegetables I'd pick up on the way, when the phone rang. It was Priya. Her voice had a rushed quality to it, the kind of rush that doesn't come from being late for something, but from trying to get through a conversation before it can turn into a longer one. She told me that this weekend wasn't a good time. She said it might be better if I waited until next month. I asked if everything was all right, the way you do, more out of habit than real concern, because in 11 years of knowing her, Priya has never once given me a reason to worry. It's too much trouble right now, Harold. That was all she said. 4 words that landed harder than she probably intended, though I don't think she meant them the way I heard them. I've thought about that sentence more times than I'd like to admit since then. Too much trouble, not the visit, not the timing. Me. That's how it settled in my chest, whether that was fair to her or not. I didn't argue. I've never been a man who argues, especially not with the people I love. I told her I understood, and I meant it, or at least I told myself I meant it. We said our goodbyes, and I hung up the phone, and I sat at that kitchen table for a long time doing what I've gotten good at since Margaret passed, turning quiet into an answer, when really it was just quiet. I put the recipe box back in the cabinet where it lives. I didn't unpack the bag right away. Some part of me, I think, wanted to leave it sitting there a little longer, as if that meant the visit hadn't really been canceled, just postponed by a day, an hour, some small technicality I hadn't caught yet. I thought about calling Tom, just to hear his voice, to ask if there was something going on that Priya hadn't wanted to say outright. But I didn't. That's the thing about being a father to a grown son. You learn where the line is, or you think you do, and you spend a lot of energy not crossing it, even when something in your gut tells you that maybe this time you should. Margaret would have called. She always said I was too careful with people, too willing to let them have their silence, when what they really needed was somebody willing to ask the second question. I used to tell her that not everybody wants to be asked the second question. Now I wonder if I was just protecting myself from an answer I wasn't ready to hear. I spent that evening doing small things around the house. I fixed a loose hinge on the pantry door that had been bothering me for weeks. I watered the plants Margaret used to keep, the ones I've kept alive out of stubbornness more than any real gift for it. I told myself this was fine, that families go through seasons, that Tom and Priya were busy, that everybody gets too much trouble sometimes. By the time I went to bed, I'd almost convinced myself of it. The phone was still sitting on the kitchen table the next morning when I came down for coffee, right where I'd left it, and I remember looking at it and feeling a small, foolish flicker of hope that it might ring again, that Priya might call back and say she'd changed her mind, that it wasn't too much trouble after all. It didn't ring that day or the day after that. It rang 3 days later. And when I picked it up, the voice on the other end didn't belong to Priya, or to Tom, or to anyone I recognized at all. Mr. Devries? Harold Devries? The voice was unfamiliar, a man's voice, businesslike but not unkind, the kind of voice you hear from someone reading off a screen while they talk to you. I said that was me, and asked who was calling, and he told me his name was Nathan Reyes. that he managed a property on Wallace Street, and that he'd been trying to reach me for 2 weeks about a lease renewal. I remember standing very still in my kitchen, the coffee pot still gurgling behind me, trying to make sense of the words he'd just said. Wallace Street. I'd know Wallace Street. I told him as much. Told him he must have the wrong Harold DeVries, that there had to be another man with my name somewhere, because I hadn't rented a property in over 40 years, not since Margaret and I bought this house. He didn't sound convinced. He said he had my information right in front of him, my date of birth. He read it out, and it was correct, down to the year. My social security number, or at least the last 4 digits, which he read next, careful and businesslike, the way a man reads something he's confirmed 100 times before and expects to be confirmed 101st. Those 4 digits were mine. I sat down at the kitchen table, right where I'd been sitting 3 days earlier, when Priya told me it was too much trouble. I asked him, slow and careful, to explain exactly what he was talking about, because something in me had gone quiet and alert at the same time, the way it used to go quiet and alert out on the tracks, when a signal reading didn't match what my eyes were telling me. He explained that back in the spring, a family had signed a lease on a 2-bedroom unit he managed. Because their income didn't fully meet the property's requirements on its own, they'd needed a guarantor, someone willing to put their name behind the lease in case a payment was ever missed. He said I was listed as that guarantor. He said my information had been submitted along with the application, and that everything had gone through properly at the time, no red flags, nothing unusual. But now, with renewal season coming and rent going up more than expected, he needed to confirm my details directly, since guarantors are supposed to be informed of any changes. I asked him for the names on the lease. He hesitated, the kind of hesitation a man has when he already knows the answer is going to complicate things. And then he told me, Thomas DeVries. Priya DeVries. I don't know how long I sat there after he said it, long enough that he asked if I was still on the line. I told him I was. I told him there had been some kind of mistake, that I needed to look into it and would call him back, and I took down his number with a hand that wasn't as steady as I would have liked. He was polite about it, said he understood, said these things happen more often than people think, mixed up paperwork, and I thanked him and hung up the phone. I sat at that table for a long time after that. My son's name, my daughter-in-law's name, my name sitting alongside theirs on a piece of paper I'd never seen, for an apartment 200 miles from here that I didn't know existed, tied to a lease agreement nobody had ever mentioned to me. Not once, not in a phone call, not in a visit, not in all the beef stew dinners and Sunday afternoons over the last several months. I thought about the timing of it. Spring, he'd said. That would have been not long after I'd last visited, back when everything between us still felt the way it always had, easy and warm. Priya asking about Margaret's stew recipe. Tom telling me about some project at work he was excited about. Nothing about that visit had felt like a family quietly falling apart behind a locked door. And then, sitting there with my coffee gone cold in front of me, another thought arrived, one I didn't want but couldn't push away. Too much trouble, Priya had said, just 3 days before this call came in. I'd taken that to mean something about me, about my age, about becoming the kind of burden a man dreads becoming. But sitting there with Nathan Reyes's voice still echoing in my ears, I wondered for the first time if it hadn't been about me at all. If maybe there was something in that apartment on Wallace Street she hadn't wanted me anywhere near. I thought about calling Tom right then. My hand was actually on the phone. But something held me back, some old instinct from 34 years of reading signals before I ever trusted my eyes. I didn't have the whole picture yet. I didn't know if this was a misunderstanding, a mistake, or something worse, and I've learned the hard way that a man who asks a question before he understands what he's really asking usually gets an answer built to protect the other person, not to tell him the truth. So I did something I don't think Tom or Priya would have expected of me. I decided I wasn't going to call and ask. I was going to find out for myself. I've never been the kind of man who moves fast when something matters. 34 years on the railroad taught me that the men who get hurt, or get others hurt, are usually the ones who trust their first read of a situation instead of checking it twice. A signal that looks green from a distance can still be a signal you misread. So the next morning, instead of picking up the phone and calling my son, I got in my truck and drove down to Fairview Credit Union, where I've kept my accounts since before Tom was born. Carla Ibbotson has managed that branch for going on 15 years now. She and Margaret used to sit together at the church fundraisers, and she still asks about me every time I walk in, the way people do in a town where everybody's known everybody long enough to mean it. I told her I needed to understand something about my credit, that a property manager 2 states over had called me about a guarantor agreement I didn't remember signing, and I watched her face change from friendly to careful in about half a second. She sat me down at her desk and pulled up my file. It took her a few minutes, tapping through screens, her eyes narrowing slightly the way they do when something doesn't sit right with her. Finally, she turned the monitor toward me, and there it was, an inquiry from the spring tied to a rental application. My name, my date of birth, my social security number, not just the last 4 digits this time, but the whole thing, sitting right there in black and white on a form I had never seen. I asked her the question I'd been afraid to ask out loud. I asked if this looked like the kind of thing that happens when someone steals your identity, some stranger pulling numbers out of the air and hoping they land somewhere useful. She was quiet for a moment before she answered, and when she did, her voice was gentle but honest, the way a good friend's voice is when she's about to tell you something you don't want to hear. She said that in her experience, strangers who steal identities don't usually have your date of birth memorized correctly, along with your full legal name, current address, and employment history from a company you retired from over a decade ago. She said whoever filled out that application knew me well. I sat with that for a minute. The coffee shop noise outside the window kept going, cars passing, somebody's radio playing too loud, life continuing on the other side of the glass, like nothing in my world had just quietly rearranged itself. I asked her if there was any way to tell exactly who had submitted the application, and she told me that the paperwork itself wouldn't say, not directly, but there would likely be a physical or digital signature somewhere on file with the property management company, something with a name attached to it beyond just the applicants listed. She offered to help me put together a formal request, the kind you send when you suspect fraud, the kind that comes with real consequences once it starts moving. I told her I needed a little more time before I did anything that official. She didn't push. She just squeezed my hand across the desk, the way she used to when Margaret was still around, and told me to call her the moment I needed anything, day or night. Driving home, I found myself thinking less about the paperwork itself, and more about how a person ends up needing a guarantor in the first place. Somewhere in the back of my mind, an old memory was working its way loose, something about Tom and Priya's move to that city, 3 years back now. I remembered a conversation from around that time, one I hadn't thought much about since. Margaret's brother, Dale, had mentioned something about helping them get set up, co-signing something, being the kind of family member who steps in so young folks starting out don't have to struggle so much with landlords who don't know their names yet. I hadn't thought about Dale in a long while. He and Tom had a falling out somewhere along the way, something neither of them ever explained to me in full, and Dale had drifted to the edges of our family gatherings the way people do when nobody wants to be the one who brings up what happened. I'd assumed it was just one of those things, pride on both sides, nothing worth digging into. But sitting in my truck outside the credit union, turning the ignition but not yet pulling out of the lot, it occurred to me that if Dale had once been the one standing behind Tom and Priya's lease, and Dale wasn't standing there anymore, then something had to have filled that gap. And it looked like that something had turned out to be me. Without my knowledge, without my permission, and without a single word said about it in 11 months of phone calls and dinners and Sunday visits where everything had seemed, on the surface, exactly the way it always had. I decided I needed to talk to Dale before I talked to anyone else. He was the only person left who might tell me the truth without trying to protect somebody first. I found Dale's number in the same address book. Margaret kept for 30 years, the leather one with the corners worn soft, still sitting in the drawer under the phone in the hallway. I hadn't called him in longer than I wanted to admit. Not since Margaret's funeral, really, when he'd stood at the back of the church looking like a man who wasn't sure he'd earned the right to be up front with the rest of us. I remember thinking at the time that grief does strange things to families, pulls some people closer and pushes others further out, and I'd never taken the time to ask which one had happened with Dale. He picked up on the 4th ring, sounding surprised to hear my voice, the way people do when a call comes from someone they've quietly assumed has moved on without them. We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, his health, the weather, an old friend of ours who'd passed that spring. I let the conversation breathe a little before I brought up why I was really calling, because I've learned that people tell you more when they don't feel like they're being questioned. Eventually, I asked him about the lease. I asked if he remembered helping Tom and Priya get set up when they first moved, if he'd ever been a guarantor on their apartment. The silence on the other end of the line told me most of what I needed to know before he said a single word. He admitted it slowly, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying a long time. He said yes, he had co-signed for them, back when they first moved, back before things between him and Tom had gone the way they'd gone. He said he'd been glad to do it at the time, that it felt good to be useful to Margaret's grandson in a way that mattered. I asked him what happened, what changed. He was quiet again, and then he told me about a loan. Not a large one, he said, though I could hear in his voice that the amount hadn't been the real wound. Tom had borrowed money from him 2 years back, for a car repair, he said, something urgent at the time, and had promised to pay it back within a few months. Months turned into a year turned into silence, the kind where neither man wanted to be the one who brought it up first, until eventually it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the fact that neither of them knew how to fix what the money had broken. Dale told me that when the lease came up for renewal last year, the property company had wanted a fresh guarantor agreement, something updated, and Dale had told them no. Not out of spite, he said, though I could hear him second-guessing that word even as he used it. He said he just couldn't put his name behind somebody who couldn't look him in the eye anymore, and that he'd told Tom exactly that, plainly, expecting Tom to understand why. I asked if he knew what happened after that, whether he knew who had stepped in once he'd stepped back. He said no. He said he'd assumed they found another way, or that maybe they'd moved somewhere that didn't require a guarantor at all. He sounded surprised, genuinely surprised, when I told him it looked like my name had ended up on the new agreement instead, without me ever being asked. There was a long pause after that, and when Dale spoke again, his voice had changed, gone quieter, almost apologetic, as if some part of this now felt like his fault too, a stone he'd set rolling without meaning to. He said he was sorry, that he hadn't meant for anything like that to happen, that if he'd known Tom would go looking for another name to put on that paperwork, he might have handled things differently. I told him it wasn't his fault. I meant it, mostly. But I'll admit that hanging up the phone, I felt something in my chest I hadn't expected, a kind of grief that had nothing to do with Margaret at all. Grief for a family that had apparently been quietly falling apart at the seams for 2 years, in ways I hadn't seen, hadn't been told, hadn't been trusted with, while I sat in my kitchen thinking the worst thing happening to any of us was that I missed my wife too much some mornings to get out of bed before 7. I thought about Tom as a boy, how proud he'd always been, too proud sometimes, the kind of pride I recognized because I'd handed it down to him without meaning to. I thought about how a man like that would rather let a rift with his own uncle sit unspoken for 2 years than admit out loud that he needed help. And I thought about Priya's voice on the phone, rushed and apologetic. Too much trouble, she'd said. I understood now that she probably hadn't been talking about me needing looked after. She'd been talking about something in that apartment she didn't want me anywhere near. Something with my name attached to it that nobody had worked up the courage to explain. I sat in my chair long after I hung up with Dale, watching the evening settle over the yard, and I made a decision I hadn't expected to make so soon. I wasn't going to wait for another phone call, another careful excuse, another version of the truth filtered through somebody's fear of disappointing me. I was going to drive up there myself. I packed the truck the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, the way I used to pack for early shifts back when a delayed signal repair meant a freight line sat waiting somewhere in the dark. Habits like that don't leave a man, even decades after the job does. I filled a thermos with coffee, checked the oil, and stood in the kitchen for a long moment looking at the cabinet where Margaret's recipe box lived. I almost left it behind. Some part of me reasoned that I wasn't driving up there for a cooking weekend, that whatever I was about to walk into had nothing to do with beef stew or old recipe cards written in a dead woman's careful handwriting. But another part of me, the part that's never been able to leave a job half finished, decided that box belonged in that truck, whether the visit went the way I hoped or not. If nothing else, it would remind everyone in that apartment, including me, of what we were supposed to be protecting. The drive gave me more time than I wanted with my own thoughts. 200 miles is a long way to sit with a mind that won't stop turning something over. I thought about Tom as a boy, maybe 9 or 10, standing in the driveway of this same house watching me change a tire, refusing to let me finish it for him even after his hands were black with grease and his knuckles were scraped raw. Margaret used to say he got that from me, that stubborn refusal to ask for help, even when help was standing 3 feet away with its sleeves already rolled up. I used to think that was something to be proud of. Sitting in that truck, watching the exits go by, I wasn't so sure anymore. I thought about Margaret, too, the way I still do more than I probably should, especially on long drives when there's nothing else to occupy the quiet. She was always the one who noticed things before I did. She would have caught the change in Tom's voice on the phone months ago, would have asked the second question I never asked, would have shown up on their doorstep with a casserole and a look that told both of them. She already knew something was wrong and wasn't leaving until they told her what. I wondered, somewhere around the state line, what she would think of me now, driving 200 miles uninvited to confront our son and his wife about a secret I'd stumbled into by accident. Part of me worried she'd tell me to turn around, to call first, to give them the dignity of choosing when to tell me the truth instead of having it dragged out of them. But another part of me, the part that had spent 3 days turning too much trouble over and over in my mind, believed she would have done exactly what I was doing. She never did have much patience for silence, when the truth was sitting right there waiting to be spoken. By the time I crossed into the city, the sun was dropping low behind the buildings, throwing long shadows across streets I only half remembered from previous visits. I'd always come up before with a date and a time confirmed, Priya's excited voice on the phone telling me what groceries they still needed for the stew, texting directions to a new coffee shop he wanted to show me. This time I hadn't called ahead at all. I told myself it was because I didn't want to give anyone time to prepare an explanation before I'd had a chance to see things as they really were, though if I'm honest, some smaller, more frightened part of me was afraid that if I called first, they'd find some new reason to tell me not to come. I found their street without much trouble. A quiet block lined with older apartment buildings, brick, and tired but well kept, the kind of place a young family settles into with the hope of eventually settling into something bigger. I parked across from their building and sat there for a minute with the engine off, my hands still on the wheel, lurking up. Whatever it is a father works up before he knocks on his son's door uninvited, carrying a question that's going to change something between them no matter how it gets answered. I reached over and picked up the recipe box from the passenger seat before I got out, holding it against my side the way I might have carried a toolbox onto a job site, something familiar to steady my hands. Walking up to that building, I noticed the front door of their unit stood slightly ajar, just a few inches, the kind of gap that might mean someone had stepped out for a moment or might mean something else entirely. I climbed the 2 steps to the door, raised my hand to knock, and stopped. Through that narrow gap, I could see straight down the hallway into their kitchen, and what I saw there made my hand hang in the air a moment longer than it should have. The kitchen counter was covered in envelopes. Not the ordinary clutter of a busy household, catalogs and grocery lists, and the kind of mail that piles up when life gets ahead of you, but a stack of them, unopened, some with red print visible even from where I stood, the kind of red print that means past due. The kind of red print I remembered from a hard stretch Margaret and I went through ourselves decades back, before Tom was old enough to notice or remember. Next to the stack sat a folded flyer, bright and glossy, the kind you get from a moving company advertising discounted rates for local relocations. I stood there in that narrow gap of doorway, a long moment, my hand still raised from the knock I hadn't finished, feeling something in my chest sink the way it does when a piece falls into place you'd hoped wouldn't fit. I knocked, finally 3 careful taps, and I heard movement inside, quick and startled, the sound of someone crossing a room faster than they meant to. Priya opened the door, and for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. She looked thinner than I remembered from my last visit, tired in a way that makeup hadn't quite managed to cover, her eyes going wide and then careful, the same careful I'd heard in her voice on the phone 4 days earlier. Harold. She said my name like she was still deciding whether it was really me standing there. We didn't know you were coming. I told her I was sorry for showing up without calling first, and I meant it, even with everything sitting heavy in my chest. I held up the recipe box, an old habit, a peace offering before I'd said anything that needed offering peace for, and I watched her eyes drop to it, and then back up to my face, something breaking loose behind them that she was working hard to hold in place. She stepped back to let me in, the way politeness demands, even when every part of a person wants to do the opposite. And I walked past her into that kitchen I'd cooked in a dozen times before, the same kitchen where Priya had once laughed so hard at one of my old railroad stories that she'd nearly dropped a full pot of stew on the floor. It didn't feel like that kitchen anymore. Why? It felt like a room where something had been slowly closing in for a long time. Tom came around the corner from the hallway, and I watched his face do something I hadn't seen it do since he was a boy caught in a lie too big for him to talk his way out of. Surprise first, then something that looked almost like relief, and then, right behind it, a shame so plain on his face that I had to look away for a second before I could say anything at all. Dad. His voice cracked slightly on the single word. What are you doing here? I set the recipe box down on the counter, right beside that stack of unopened envelopes, close enough that all three of us could see them sitting there together, evidence and heirlooms side by side, the two halves of whatever this family had become without me knowing it. I told him about the phone call from Nathan Reyes. I told him about Carla at the credit union, about the application with my full information on it, about driving to see Dale and hearing, for the first time, about the loan that never got repaid, and the guarantor spot that had opened up because of it. I kept my voice level as I spoke, not out of anger, though anger was somewhere in there too, but because I needed them to hear all of it clearly, without my own emotion getting in the way of the facts. Priya's hand came up to cover her mouth partway through, and by the time I finished, she wasn't holding back anymore. Her shoulders started to shake, quiet at first, and then not quiet at all, the kind of crying that comes from a person who has been strong for far too long and finally isn't required to be for one more minute. Tom didn't move to comfort her right away. He stood there instead, looking at those envelopes on the counter like he was seeing them for the first time himself. Though I knew that wasn't true, and something in his stillness told me he'd been carrying something even heavier than what I already understood. Dad, I can explain, he said, though his voice didn't sound like a man who had an explanation ready. It sounded like a man who had been dreading this exact moment for so long that now that it had finally arrived, he didn't know where to begin. I pulled out one of the kitchen chairs, the same kind we used to sit in together over bowls of Margaret's stew, and I sat down, and I told him I wasn't going anywhere until I understood everything, the whole of it, not the parts that were easiest to say. Priya wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a shaking breath, and was the one who spoke first. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Priya's voice came out rough, scraped down to something raw I'd never heard from her before. None of it was supposed to happen this way, Harold. I swear to you. Leave my. She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down like her legs had finally given up, holding the rest of her together. Tom stayed standing a moment longer, one hand braced against the counter, before he lowered himself into the third chair, the one that used to be Margaret's whenever she'd visit with me, and something about him sitting there in that particular chair made this all feel even more like a family coming apart at us a seam. None of us had known was fraying. Priya told it slowly, in pieces, the way people tell things they've rehearsed not saying for a long time. She said that when Dale pulled back as guarantor, the property management company had given them 30 days to find someone else, or risk losing the lease entirely, right in the middle of a year that had already gone sideways in ways I still didn't fully understand. She said she'd panicked. She said she'd found my information in an old file Tom kept, papers from years back when I'd helped them with a car loan, and she'd told herself it was just a formality, that nothing would ever actually happen because of it, that surely I'd never even need to know. I told myself it was temporary, she said, not quite looking at me. We'd get things sorted out and quietly take your name off it before you ever found out. I know how that sounds now. I knew how it sounded then too, if I'm honest. I just didn't let myself think about it long enough to stop. I asked her, as gently as I could manage, what exactly had gone sideways? What had made 30 days feel like a cliff edge instead of an inconvenience? She looked at Tom then, and something passed between them, some silent negotiation about who was going to say the rest of it. Lee. And it was Tom who finally spoke, his voice low, steady, in a way that told me he'd known this moment was coming even if he hadn't known when. I lost my job, Dad, 8 months ago. The kitchen went very quiet after that. 8 months. Long enough that it had happened before Dale ever pulled back as guarantor. Long enough that it had been sitting underneath every phone call, every visit, every bowl of stew we'd shared since. hidden behind ordinary conversation about weather and work projects that no longer existed. He told me the rest without me having to ask. The company had restructured, cut an entire department, his position along with it, low warning, beyond a meeting that lasted 11 minutes. He said he'd told himself he'd find something within a few weeks, that there was no reason to worry anyone, especially not me. Not so soon after Margaret. Not when I already had enough to carry on my own. Weeks became months. Interviews came and went, promising and then quietly going nowhere, the way they do in industries that don't have much room left in them. He'd taken some freelance work here and there, enough to keep some money coming in, but never enough to cover what a full salary used to cover. He said Priya had picked up extra shifts at the clinic where she works, that between the two of them they'd been managing, barely, scraping together rent and bills every month through a combination of overtime and a shrinking savings account neither of them had told anyone about. And then the guarantor requirement came due, right in the middle of all of it, one more weight added onto a pile that was already threatening to tip over. I didn't want you to know, Tom said, and his voice cracked properly this time, no longer holding steady. You always told me a man takes care of his own. I couldn't come to you and tell you I couldn't even do that much. Not after everything you and Mom built. Not after you'd already lost her. I sat there with that for a long moment, feeling something crack open in my own chest, something that had less to do with anger and more to do with recognition. I thought about my own father, a man who never once admitted he was struggling with anything, who taught me, without ever saying it directly, that asking for help was its own kind of failure. I'd told myself for years I hadn't passed that particular lesson down to Tom. Sitting in that kitchen, looking at my grown son's face, I understood I'd been wrong about that the same way I'd been wrong about a lot of things these past few days. And the visit, I said quietly, though I already knew the answer before I finished asking. Canceling the visit, that was because of this. Priya nodded, her eyes filling again. I couldn't have you here, seeing all this, not knowing what to say if you asked why there were bills everywhere, or why Tom wasn't leaving for work in the mornings. I panicked. I said the wrong thing. I never meant for you to think it was about you being trouble, Harold. You were never the trouble. You were the one thing I was trying to protect. The room stayed quiet after that, the three of us sitting around that table with the truth finally out in the open between us. Heavier now that it had a name, but somehow, strangely, lighter too, the way a weight always is, once you're no longer the only one carrying it alone. I sat with the quiet a while before I said anything else. There's a way silence can turn cruel if you let it stretch too long after a confession like that, and I didn't want either of them thinking my quiet was judgment, even though some small, prideful part of me was still working through what I felt. Mostly what I felt, once I let myself sit with it honestly, wasn't anger. It was grief for a son who'd spent 8 months believing he had to carry all of this alone, and for a daughter-in-law who'd made a desperate choice out of love, twisted sideways by fear. I'm not going to pretend this doesn't hurt, I told them, and I watched Tom flinch slightly, bracing for whatever he thought was coming next. Using my name without asking me, that's a serious thing, Priya. That's not a small thing, no matter how frightened you were when you did it. I need you to understand I'm not brushing past that. She nodded, not arguing, her eyes still wet but steadier now. The kind of steady that comes after a person has already accepted whatever's about to be said to them. But I also understand fear, I continued. I understand what it does to good people when they feel like they're out of options. I'm not going to sit here and act like I've never made a decision I wasn't proud of because I was scared of what would happen if I didn't. Tom's hand had found Priya's at some point during her confession, their fingers laced together on top of that kitchen table. I found myself looking at their joined hands for a moment before I said what I'd been turning over the whole drive up. Here's what I'm not going to do, I said. I'm not going to write a check and pretend that fixes any of this. I've got savings. Lord knows I don't need much these days living alone in that house. But if I hand you money right now, all we're doing is trading one hidden problem for another. You'll still be a family that hides things from each other when times get hard. That's the part that scares me more than any lease agreement. Tom started to say something, some version of gratitude or apology I don't think either of us needed right then, and I held up a hand to stop him gently. What I will do, I said, Lee, is help you do this the right way, properly, out in the open where nobody has to hide anything from anybody ever again. I told them my plan, laid out slow and plain, the way I used to walk a crew through a repair before we ever touched a tool. First, Mom needed to call Nathan Reyes himself, Not me covering for him, not me smoothing it over on his behalf, but Tom explaining honestly what had happened and working out, man to man, how to correct the guarantor paperwork properly with my knowledge and my actual signature this time, if that's what still made sense once everything was out in the light. Second, I wanted Tom back in touch with Dale, not through me relaying messages between two stubborn men who'd let 2 years slip by over an unpaid debt neither of them had the courage to discuss out loud. That debt needed settling too, on whatever terms the two of them could work out honestly, face to face. And the job, I said, looking at Tom directly. I've still got contacts from 30 years in this business, people who owe me favors, people who know people. I'm not going to hand you a job because that's not mine to give and it wouldn't do you any good in the long run anyway. But I'll make calls. I'll open doors. What you do once you're standing in front of them is up to you. Tom's eyes were wet now, too. Something in his face loosening for the first time since I'd walked through that door, like a man finally setting down a bag he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten how heavy it actually was. Why didn't you just come here yelling? He asked quietly. Instead of all this, I thought about that question longer than it probably deserved. Because your mother would have, I said finally. She always did have more nerve than me. But she also would have told you that yelling doesn't fix a family. Honesty does. I'm trying to give you both a chance to practice honesty before it becomes one more thing you're afraid of. Priya reached over then and pulled the recipe box toward her, running her thumb along that rusted corner the way she used to whenever we cooked together. And for the first time since I'd arrived, something like a real small smile broke through the exhaustion on her face. Is it too late for stew tonight? She asked. I told her it was never too late for stew, and for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, that kitchen finally started to feel like the one I remembered. The days that followed didn't fix everything overnight, but they moved, steady and real, the way a stalled repair finally starts moving once you've located the actual break instead of guessing at it. I stayed in that city longer than I'd planned, 4 extra days beyond what I'd packed for, sleeping on their pull-out couch and waking each morning to the sound of Tom on the phone in the next room, his voice, low and businesslike in a way, that told me he was finally handling things directly instead of letting them pile up unopened on a counter. He called Nathan Reyes the first morning, with me sitting close enough to listen but far enough to let him do his own talking. I watched my son explain the situation plainly, no excuses dressed up as explanations, just the truth about the job loss, the guarantor mix-up, and his intention to correct it the right way. Reyes, to his credit, was more understanding than either of us expected. He told Tom this kind of thing happened more often than people like to admit, and that as long as a legitimate guarantor stepped forward now, properly, with documentation, the lease could be corrected without anything going on, anyone's record the wrong way. I sat down with the paperwork that afternoon and did it properly this time, my own hand on the pen, my own eyes reading every line before I signed it, Tom and Priya watching from across the table, like two people witnessing something they weren't sure they still deserved to witness. There's a difference, I told them, between a man's name being used and a man giving his name freely. The paperwork looked the same either way, same lines, same signature, but everything underneath it was different now. And all three of us in that kitchen understood exactly what that difference meant. Dale was harder. Tom put off calling him for 2 full days, old pride working against him, even with everything else finally moving in the right direction. And on the 3rd morning, I finally told him, plainly, that I hadn't driven 200 miles to watch him fix one broken thing while leaving another one to rot in the same house. He called that afternoon. I wasn't in the room for that conversation, out of respect for what needed to happen between them without a father hovering nearby. But I heard enough from the hallway to know it wasn't easy. Voices rose at first, old hurt, working itself loose, the way infected wounds sometimes do before they can finally start closing. But by the end of it, I heard something I hadn't expected to hear so soon, something that sounded almost like relief passing between two men finally saying out loud what they'd been avoiding for 2 years. Tom told him about the job loss, told him about the guarantor situation, about my name ending up on that lease because Dale's had come off it. Dale, for his part, apologized for pulling away the way he had without ever explaining himself properly, admitted he'd been more hurt than he'd let on. That hurt had made him harder than he meant to be. They didn't solve 2 years of distance in one phone call. Nobody does. But Dale mentioned, before they hung up, that he wanted to come up for a visit soon. Maybe help Tom with some of those job leads I'd started working on, And something in Tom's voice when he told me that afterward sounded lighter than I'd heard it in longer than 8 months. I made my calls too, the ones I'd promised. Old colleagues from the rail company, a foreman I used to work under, who'd since moved into a management position at a logistics firm, a fellow I'd trained years back who now ran his own small operation. None of them owed Tom anything. I was careful to make that clear to him too, that these were doors opening, not guarantees walking through them. But by the time I finally packed my truck to head home, Tom had 2 interviews lined up for the following week, the first real movement he'd had in 8 months of trying. The evening before I left, Priya made the stew herself, following Margaret's recipe card without my help this time, getting the seasoning almost exactly right, close enough that I didn't correct her, because some things a person needs to learn to do on their own, even when somebody who knows better is standing right there. We ate together at that kitchen table, the three of us, no envelopes on the counter anymore. No careful silences hiding what shouldn't have needed hiding in the first place. You should have just told me, I said at one point, not as an accusation, just as something true that needed saying one more time before I left. All of it. Months ago. Tom nodded slowly, looking down at his bowl. I know that now. I think some part of me always knew it. I just kept telling myself I could fix it before you ever had to find out. And every week that went by, it got harder to imagine telling you at all. Some things, I told him, aren't yours to carry alone just because you're scared of what I'll think of you for needing help. That's not what family's for. Priya reached over and squeezed my hand across the table. Her eyes bright but steady now, none of that rushed fear left in them anymore. Next time, she said, we'll call you before it gets this bad. I promise. I told her I was holding her to that. And driving home the next morning, watching that city shrink in my rearview mirror, I found myself believing, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that she meant it. Lie. The house felt different when I got back, though nothing in it had actually changed. Same chair by the window, same quiet settling in over the yard. Each evening, same coffee at 6 with a newspaper. I still don't need lead. But something in me had shifted during those days away. Some old, worn groove finally knocked loose. And I noticed it most in the way I stopped bracing myself every time the phone rang. Tom called that first week home, and then the week after, not because anything had gone wrong, but just to talk, the way we used to before Margaret passed, before 8 months of silence, had quietly built a wall neither of us had meant to build. He told me about the interviews, one that hadn't gone anywhere, and one that had gone well enough that a second round was already scheduled. He told me about a Sunday afternoon he and Dale had spent together, no big speeches, Loshi. Just the two of them working on Dale's truck in his driveway, the way men do when they're rebuilding something and don't quite have the words for it yet, letting their hands do the talking instead. 3 weeks after I drove home, Priya called to ask if I still wanted to come up for a visit. I could hear something different in her voice this time, none of that rushed, careful quality from before. Just an easy warmth, the kind that used to be there before all of this started. She told me they'd gotten a little breathing room, that Tom had a real offer now, not perfect, not what he'd had before, but honest work with a company that seemed to want him there. She said Dale had already been up twice to help move some furniture around, that he'd started leaving his tools in their garage, the way family does when they've decided they're staying close for good. I packed my bag the way I always used to, 3 days early, an old habit that had once felt like readiness, and now felt like something closer to hope. I packed the recipe box too, though I noticed this time I wasn't carrying it like evidence, the way I had on that last drive up. It just felt like what it always used to be, an excuse to be together. When I pulled up outside their building, Tom was already out on the front steps waiting for me, something he hadn't done in years, and Priya came out right behind him with a smile that reached all the way to her eyes, no exhaustion hiding behind it this time. Tom hugged me the way he used to as a boy before he decided hugging his father wasn't something teenage boys did anymore. And I let myself hold on to that a moment longer than either of us probably expected. Inside, the kitchen counter was clear. No envelopes, no red print, no folded moving flyers waiting to remind everyone how close things had come to falling apart. Just the ordinary clutter of a family living an ordinary life, mail sorted and opened, a calendar on the fridge with Tom's new work schedule written in Priya's handwriting, a school flyer for a night class she'd mentioned wanting to take, now that things had settled enough to think about her own plans again. We cooked together that evening, the three of us crowded into that kitchen, the way we used to be. Priya handling the seasoning with real confidence now, Tom chopping vegetables with the same careless enthusiasm he'd had as a boy learning to help his mother, never quite as neat as Margaret would have liked, but always given with his whole heart. I stood back at one point, just watching them, feeling something in my chest loosen that had been tight since that phone call 4 weeks earlier, since those 4 words that had cut deeper than either of us realized they would at the time. Too much trouble, she'd said. I understood now that trouble was never the right word for what any of this had been. It was fear, dressed up in the wrong clothes, the kind of fear that convinces good people to carry burdens alone rather than risk disappointing the ones they love most. I'd spent 2 years since Margaret's death doing something similar myself, quietly convincing myself that needing anyone made me a burden too, that the safest thing I could offer my family was my own uncomplaining silence. I don't think I'll go back to believing that. Not fully, not after watching what silence nearly cost this family and what honesty gave back to it in return. Later that night, after the dishes were done and Tom had gone to bed early for his first day at the new job, Priya and I sat at that kitchen table a while longer, the recipe box open between us, Margaret's handwriting catching the kitchen light. Priya told me she'd been thinking about writing some of her own recipes down in there too, alongside Margaret's, so that someday whoever came after all of us would have both of their handwriting to follow, side by side, one generation folded into the next. I told her that sounded exactly right to me. The phone on the wall rang once while we sat there, an old friend of Tom's calling about something ordinary, a weekend plan, nothing more, and neither of us flinched at the sound of it the way I once might have. It was just a phone ringing in a house where nobody had anything left to hide. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that was enough to make the whole evening feel like exactly where I was supposed to be.